Hello, everybody. Back to more philosophy and more Wittgenstein. So we started Wittgenstein this morning, but let's see if we can't knock out just about everything else that we want to do here with Wittgenstein tonight. I hope. I don't know. There's a lot. There's a lot of cool things. A lot of little tidbits. Every time I lecture on Wittgenstein, you guys know I kind of do this like more organic lecture style. I'm not just like PowerPoint slides, bam, 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 bam. And usually that works out pretty good. With Wittgenstein, almost every time I give my Wittgenstein lectures, I'm like, oh, I should have said that. And when it's like a daily class, then I get more days for me to be like, oh, I'm going to say that tomorrow. But with you guys, we only had a couple sessions with it. So um, there might be some little things here and there that get left out because, Wittgenstein's not making it all hang together that well. So I hope that doesn't happen. I'm going to try to hit all the things that I think are really cool, at least the biggest ones. And there's another special thing about tonight's video lecture. Like I was saying this morning in class, Wittgenstein is really, really weird. And it's definitely a little bit of mental gymnastics or weird stretching contortionism or something like that in trying to like get a handle on what's going on here. So that's why, especially with Wittgenstein, even when I'm doing the in-class ones, I'm like, students, speak up. Like, definitely ask questions along the way here, so I can try to figure out where you're at and how you're thinking about Wittgenstein, and maybe help steer you closer to what he's up to. Hopefully, I'm not totally deluded about it either. I've spent more time on him than you guys have, but we'll try to make the most out of it here. And so I would ask because sometimes when we've been doing the video lectures, I'm like not I'm like ask a question and then there's like this like silence thing, and then like I'm like, should I wait or not? And then bam, huge amount of text just like appears or something like that. Or I don't know whether I should be waiting for that huge block of text to appear. Tonight I would like to especially ask you guys, if you want to ask a question, just type in the like chat, just type like something like this, like question colon, and then I know you've got something that you're about to say. It's kind of like the equivalent of raising your hand, and I'll chill out. I'll take a little pause from me motor mouthing things, and then I can entertain your question and hopefully answer it. Sound like a good policy? Think we can do that? Sweet, awesome. So let's do things that way. All right. If I remember where we left off here, had not quite gotten to talking about the five red apples case. But we got a sort of basic picture down of what Wittgenstein is up to in trying to give us another model for how to understand language. And the core idea here is a kind of like functionalist or use theory of meaning. That linguistic objects, like the noises I make with my mouth, or the little inscriptions I write on, say, a board, those things get the meaning that they get not based off of some kind of associated definition or associated conceptual content. It comes from the way in which that inscription or that noise or whatever is the linguistic behavior, because it could even be dancing or it could be facial expressions or it could be gestures with my hands, whatever it is. What role is that behavior playing as a part of bigger activities? That's how Wittgenstein thinks the meaning of words gets determined, or just all linguistic behavior whatsoever. The meaning is to be found in how that linguistic behavior is playing a role in other types of activities, or what we're going to call language games from Wittgenstein. So actually, right here at the outset, I wanted to kind of see whether you guys had any questions just regarding the kind of stuff that we were doing in class this morning. Because even at the basic foundations here, like what's the Augustinian model, what's Wittgenstein's general program, that sort of thing. I'd like to kind of clear up anything that I can at these early stages. Okay. Does the Augustinian model not take body language and facial expressions into account? No, it absolutely does. And in fact, those sorts of things might be where the Augustinian model seems to be on the best intuitive footing. Because what am I supposed to do with this other than like put some other sort of word or phrase or something to it? Like this doesn't seem to, this has even, I have less of an immediate connection with this than I do with noises that people make with their mouths. Like think about hearing someone speak and trying to not hear the conceptual meaning, like just to hear it as a noise. Really hard to do. It's a little easier to do it with this. Like I can do something with that. But the Augustinian model is going to make sense of this the same way it's going to make sense of this. It's going to say that when someone does this behavior, there is an association, there's a convention about what meaning this thing is supposed to have, as opposed to this, or as opposed to like this, or jazz hands, or spirit fingers. That those all have different meanings to them, and that comes from the associations that we place with that kind of gesture. Facial expressions, same sort of thing. Remember, Augustine, in that little quote at the beginning of the reading, Daniel, you can type your question too. We don't have to wait. Okay. Oh, you got it. Okay, all right. Remember, right at the beginning with that quote from Augustine, he's talking about the natural languages that all of us are like on board with from birth, like facial expressions, the play of the eyes, and that sort of stuff. So, Augustine model definitely puts that stuff in there, as does Wittgenstein. Like, maybe this is also connected with something else that came up in class this morning. I wanted to remind you about. Remember that Wittgenstein he doesn't have a monopoly here on context or about interpreting things with conversational implication or something like that. Remember Cameron had that question about that. Both Augustine and Wittgenstein can make sense of context and conversational implication. So whether one of them is the right idea or not, it won't come down to something, some sort of like basic failure to communicate or something like that. Okay, Daniel's got another question too. That concise picture you gave of Wittgenstein's model, that's what T's. The role language or symbols play in language games determines meaning still sounds like context. And that's right. That's because Wittgenstein can use context. So can Augustine. Both of them can use context. They're going to use context in a different way, though. If I'm an Augustinian, I'm going to use context as a way of trying to interpret what is the conceptual meaning that I should associate with the linguistic behavior, the signs that you demonstrated, either through talking, writing, whatever else. Okay? It's still going to be a matter of me kind of like trying to decode your behavior into a certain meaning that I'm going to think about, like a thought, concept, or an idea. For Wittgenstein, context is a very different sort of thing. For Wittgenstein, it's, again, the key part, the most key phrase here is the role that language is playing in an activity. So in other words, what are the consequences of saying this or not saying this in terms of this activity we're trying to engage in? Think of the way that Wittgenstein looks at language is it's like a move in the game. It's not something that's apart from the game or above the game or some way that we're like talking about the game or something. It's in the game. It's a move that's made in the game, and it's subject to rules. So saying something like, hello, Daniel, is like a chess move in a game. It's like something has happened now. Because I said that, things have changed. The situation is different because I said that. In what way has the situation changed? Well, that depends on the rules of the game. Like, if I move my rook to b4, that's going to make a difference based on what are the things I can do with a rook and in that position and whatever else, right? So it's rules for behavior that Wittgenstein is using as the kinds of conventions that are going to dictate meaning, not rules for interpretation, which even if we're doing conversational implication, the Augustinian model is going to be thinking about it along those lines. Like, how do I interpret to associate a meaning with a linguistic object? And Wittgenstein's trying to like ditch that. He's not trying to use that model. Does that help? Any other questions you guys have for the stuff we've already did this morning? Cool. All right. I'm not seeing any questions pop up. So okay. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. So let's get on to this 5 red apples case. So like I said this morning, the point of the 5 red apples case is not. It's not like Wittgenstein's trying to say, here's what's really going on when you are looking at a little slip of paper that says 5 red apples and going to get 5 red apples. What he's trying to do is just give an example of how we could imagine a linguistic activity being successfully performed without ever positing something like the things I'm supposed to be able to do to understand language as Augustine sees it. So Augustine sees my ability to be linguistically competent as a matter of me being able to have these associations between sign and signified. And Wittgenstein wants to try to give a counterexample to that, like a case in which the person does not understand anything of what Augustine is saying they need to understand, and yet they can still successfully complete this language task or language activity. Lawrence asks, if each bit of language is a move, is there any end goal? Yes, that's one of the problems of, well, not problems, but it's just going to be one of the natural difficulties for language games is if we're going to talk about activities, they have purpose to them, they have functional elements, that kind of thing. Um, Daniel says, so it's all about result and not the journey. For who? Are you talking about for Wittgenstein? Oh, you mean are you like referring to the successfully completing the linguistic task sort of thing? Okay, so Wittgenstein wants to say it still counts as successful communication. So there was successful communication here. If you think what happens in the five red apples case is not successful communication, that's because you're holding language captive to the Augustinian model for how to understand successful communication. Did I think of the thought that you had when you wrote down the slip of paper, five red apples? That's how Augustine's going to see successful communication. Wittgenstein's trying to offer a completely different model. And that's why it's difficult to think about and evaluate. This might be kind of what I was talking about this morning about slipping back into the Augustinian model and looking at Wittgenstein's model. I would say Wittgenstein is just as interested in process as Augustine is. He just thinks that it's a different process. There's something different going on. It's not just me decoding symbols when I'm operating linguistically. That there's a bigger thing that's going on here. But don't forget that one of the language games that we can play for Wittgenstein is going to be doing things on the Augustinian model. Remember, Wittgenstein's bull wants to hold Augustine's bull. So Wittgenstein's going to talk. I'll talk about that later. Maybe we'll get there in a little bit. Let's talk about the five red apples case. Okay, so I get a slip of paper that has something inscribed in it. Five red apples. There it is on the piece of paper. I think I gave you guys a little bit of the setup this morning. So there's like I put some more embellishment into Wittgenstein's case. I'm like, imagine an alien crash lands in the back of the grocery store, and the shopkeeper is trying to help out the alien and puts him to work in his shop. But the alien doesn't understand anything about language at all. Doesn't understand these connections of what these symbols are. But the shop owner is still, through whatever means, don't ask me how, is able to train the alien to respond to shoppers' demands. In other words, that shoppers are going to give the alien slips of paper with these inscriptions written on them, and the alien is going to get them what they're looking for. Don't ask me why this supermarket works this way, but it's just a hypothetical situation here. It's not very plausible. I think everyone would admit to this. This is just like, could this situation make sense? Actually, before we do the alien side of it, let's just think about us. So, if I ask you guys to explain what's going to happen here if I send you to the supermarket with this slip, this shopping list, it's a very weird shopping list. I'm an eccentric person, so I only want to get one thing at a time when I go to the grocery store. So I give you this slip of paper. How are you going to figure out what I'm asking for? Well, you're going to look at these inscriptions and you're going to compare them against your memory, and you're going to be like, I know what 5 stands for. It stands for a number, and it's this number, 5 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know what 5 is, and this is the inscription that's supposed to be associated with that concept. It's a number. I know that it's a number. This concept, a number. Red, I know that's a color, and I know which color it is. It's a color of stuff. red things. Here's a red thing. There we go. It's that color. All right. And I know what apples are. Apples are a certain type of macro object. They're a fruit. They have a certain shape and appearance and weight and size and all that sort of stuff. So I've got some idea here. I know when I look at this inscription, I put together a picture in my head. 5 red apples. I can do that and put it all together. Boom. And then I could crumple up this piece of paper and throw it away immediately because I know the message. I got the message. Message received. And now I'm going to go to the grocery store and find those things that match with the concept that I now have in my head. That's how we do it, right? I don't think anyone here in the chat would say this is not how you would do this task. This is what we do. This is how we think about it. And this is the Augustinian model. I'm translating, I'm decoding this inscription into a thought, and then I'm doing behavior that would match with that thought, that would correspond with that thought. Okay, so now let's talk about what the alien does instead and how they're different using the Wittgensteinian model. Oh, and we also got a... Oh, I think I missed those. Robot drones and Amazon. I guess those were relevant to something I said at a certain point. But oh, maybe as an example here, instead of aliens, it could be robot drones, maybe something like that. Or how the Amazon robots... Yeah, okay. We could think about it that way, but I mean, I like the alien in that it doesn't have... it's like a conscious being, but it's not using this model of like a mental image or a mental concept, that kind of thing. But anyway, okay. Fun times. 5 red apples. Alien gets this 5 red apples thing, has no idea what this stuff means. The alien can think, it's got concepts, but it has no idea what to associate these things with. And let's say it comes from another dimension, so it's not like it's like, oh, I see what's going on here when it gets this formal training that the shopkeeper gives him. It's not like he's like, I can figure out what's going on with the concepts here. Let's say the alien just has no clue, but it's been trained in this activity. Okay. So the alien is going to work like this. He's going to the first thing he's got to recognize, he can like notice things about shapes and letters and things like that. No problems there. Alien doesn't have to be like incapable of recognizing shapes, or game over right there. But they recognize that there are 3 components to this inscription. There's the 5 part, the red part, and the apples part. And then it's going to do a different functional task with respect to each of these. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to look for a drawer that has a label on it that matches what this third term is. So you can imagine I'm going to draw a little picture here. So it's got like a cabinet of drawers. Look at my beautiful cabinet of drawers there. And one of them has this little inscription on it that matches the inscription here. Now, all the alien knows is that these are the same shapes. Okay, so there's other labels on these other things. He just finds the drawer that has this label on it and opens it up. That's the first task. Second task, looks at the second term and takes out from its pocket a little color swatch that has been given it by the shop owner. So let me... this picture is not looking as cool, but you guys have seen color swatches before. You know, these like a little pamphlet that has little pictures of different colors. Like you go to, I don't know, a hardware store or like Home Depot and you want to get a certain type of paint, and they've got these color swatches. They're like, here's all the colors you can get. This is what they would look like. And these color swatches have little labels on them too. And that's what the second term is for. The alien is trained to pull out the color swatch for the second placeholder and look for the color swatch that has the same inscription here, just like they match the labels with the apples. They don't know what red means, and they don't know what apples are. And they don't know that they're associated with these things. But they just know that for the second term, they're supposed to take out their swatch, find the swatch that has this label, and then match that color with things inside the drawer. Then they're going to move to the first term, this 5 term. And they're going to do this activity where they take an object out of the drawer that matches the color on their swatch, and go through a kind of counting exercise. They're going to say to themselves these number words in order until they get to the word that corresponds with this one right here, with 5. So they're gonna do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, 5! I got to 5. Okay, now I stop because that's when I just get to this one. That's when I stop. Okay, that's the so that's the task. Um, if the alien does this, they've been able to do the same thing that we do when we go to the grocery store with a grocery list. We've been able to get 5 red apples into the cart without knowing anything about what these words actually mean in the Augustinian sense of sign and signified, the associative link there. But they've been able to perform this linguistic activity appropriately without being able to do what Augustine says is necessary for being able to do that. So that's how this case is supposed to work. And notice everything that happened here in this case with the alien. The reason they were able to do things was just because they knew what to do with these inscriptions. In other words, these are like the linguistic objects. They are trained in an activity that gets us what we're looking for, working off of these things. This basic metaphor for how language works, which seems really absurd in this case, is what Wittgenstein thinks is really going on underneath all of our expressions, even when we think we're playing an Augustinian style game. When I ask you like, give me the definition of this word, and you give me a definition, man, that seems really Augustinian. But Wittgenstein's going to say even that is a language game that basically would only work if we were trained in doing that activity in following certain rules. I'll talk more about that idea a little bit later, but I want to stop here and see whether there are questions about this case. I think there definitely could be, and there's some that I might head off to pass. But let's see what you guys got. Okay. How is this different from the Augustinian model? Okay, so the alien case, how is that different? How is comparing the color swatch to the apples that are red different from understanding the color red? How is using the number game to count to 5 different from counting to 5? After seeing what is in the drawer and associating it with the term apples, different than knowing what apples are. Okay, let me answer this somewhat in turn. First off, if we thought that the alien basically had a mind like ours and just didn't know English, they would probably be able to pick up on the associated meanings for these words if they wanted to. Like, they could probably play the Augustinian game here if they wanted to. And Wittgenstein pretty much says as much when he brings up this case. Let me actually pull it up. He says, yeah, let me read this quote. So that there's a little aside here that Wittgenstein is saying that's like the voice of his opponent here, Augustine himself. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red and what he is to do with the word 5? And Wittgenstein says, well, I assume that he acts as I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here. Only how the word 5 was used. So this is a kind of a clue to what Wittgenstein is trying to say with this, that it really, even though I could come up with concepts if I wanted to, is that really the meaning of what's going on here? Do I have to do that? And Wittgenstein says, no, you don't. It really just comes down to whether the person knew what to do with the words. And they did it in a very different way than the standard model. Let me try to break down each of these other things too. I mean, and actually, one of the ways that, I don't know if you intended to word your question this way, Rob, but with the way your questions are worded, like, how is this different? To a certain extent, Wittgenstein's going to say it isn't different, because what I'm describing with this alien case is exactly what's going on ultimately when it comes to the Augustinian case. That all it means for me to be able to understand things like red and apples and 5 and that sort of stuff is to just be able to act in the proper way with respect to those linguistic objects. That's what Wittgenstein wants to say about it. But, I mean, there is a distinction that we can recognize here in that in the case as the alien case is described, the alien is never thinking anything other than the rules of the activity. They're not thinking of the concept of 5 red apples. That never shows up in representational consciousness or something like that for the alien. Let me really demonstrate this with the whole 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing. I think this is where it's clearest. The game that the alien is playing is just pulling things out of the drawer that match the color swatch until they reach a certain counting word, and then they stop. But the words that are in this counting list could have been arbitrary. They could have been like, it could have been Beavis, Butthead, Frisbees, Bananas, 5. And then when he gets to 5, he's like, okay, there it is. I'm going to stop. Okay. So the alien doesn't have to even have a concept of what numbers are. By just behaving in the way that they're behaving, that they're like saying words on a list and taking things out of the drawer, that when they get to the certain word and they stop, it's going to be 5. Okay, because of how the list is constructed. If 5 was in the spot that 7 would be in, then you'd get 7 when you said 5 or something like that. So it'd go wrong. But as long as the alien is trained properly by having the right counting list, this will work out every time. I don't know if this is helping. Let me know if it's helping. Usually when I'm doing Vic and Sign, it's like there's a question, I give an answer, and they're like, I'm still not sold on that. So let me know so we can kind of work that out. Let's talk about red, because this might be another one that was kind of difficult. If the alien is using the color swatch, that doesn't mean that they're associating the color that's on the color swatch with the color red. They don't know that red stands for this color or something like that. They just know what to do when they see red inscribed on that sheet of paper. They know that they're supposed to take out the swatch, find the swatch that has that inscription on it, and then match it up to objects. And if it's sufficiently close, then they'll pull those things and put them in the basket. The counting thing seems semantic or somatic? Semantic? Yeah, okay. I mean, semantics is what we're debating here. That's our question. Semantics is about linguistic meaning and what is determining it. And so Wittgenstein is trying to say, look, what's determining meaning in this case is how the alien is acting, what they're doing in response to the words, not putting a concept or an idea or a thought into their head. I'm going to actually, I want to transition into the piano metaphor here, but I want to get some of these other questions first. Okay. All right, Ayaka, you say, in this situation, alien doesn't know only English. Does he know another language? Let's say he doesn't know any language at all. The case would be fine if they don't know any language whatsoever. That they are still able to think and they're able to be trained to follow rules. That's the really key part here. And you might be like, well, how is he supposed to learn the rules if he doesn't know language? Or that's going to open up some other cans of worms. Vic and Sign, like what we're going to get here. My lecture on Wittgenstein is only going to be able to go so far because the reading that we have is only able to go so far too. But Wittgenstein has a lot of questions to answer for his wacky theory. And I'll try to give you the best hint of what's going on here. But this will be one question about like Wittgenstein wants to say linguistic objects get their meaning based on the role that they're playing in a language game, in an activity that involves linguistic objects. What's a language game? Well, a language game is defined by an activity that has its shape because of certain rules and conventions. Okay, well, how are those rules and conventions set? And how do we learn those things? If we're going to learn language, we have to learn the rules. How do we learn the rules? What's going on there? Wittgenstein's going to have an answer to that too. Here's something I might offer as just a really quick off-the-cuff answer rather than something that's more like technical and worked out. But think about okay, here's an example that fits really good with Wittgensteinian thinking, and it's visiting a foreign country. So you might study a language in school, and you study it formally, and you're learning all of the associated connections between symbols and what they stand for. Basically, if you take a language class, you're just playing an Augustinian language game over and over and over. You're doing flashcards to memorize vocabulary. You're learning the rules about how things are put together grammatically so you can come up with the right thought. So you can think the right thing in your head when you see a word on a page or you hear someone speaking. Then you get to the foreign country, and things are very different. It's not just this mechanical process. And yeah, we can explain some of that through conversational implication and the rest of it. But then you start to uncover words that you're like, this word I don't know how to translate into my natural language, my first language. Like, this word is weird. And in fact, there's some aspects about the words that I thought I had good translations for. There's nuances here that seem to have to do with the culture of the people who use that language. And Wittgenstein's going to say, boom, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That if we're going to talk about a language, we have to talk about a form of life, a way of living that's set by rules and expectations and conventions for behavior, not these kinds of conventions for language, not like the decoding of a dictionary or something like that. But it's about the rules for how we behave with each other. Now, sorry, I'm really thirsty, and I'm going motor mouth again. Start spitting. Okay. Um, so where was I? So when I go to that foreign country and I live there for a while, at first things are really weird, and I'm like stepping on toes, making social faux pas and stuff all over the place. Like, I'm getting things wrong. I'm not playing the game right, the game of life. I'm not playing in connection with the conventions of that culture. Things are getting really wacky. But I start to learn. I'm like from like being corrected, and I might not even be able to tell you what the rules are, but I'm picking them up somehow. I think this example would be a place to go looking for the beginning of an answer to how we learn language games for Wittgenstein, like what Wittgenstein could say for how we pick this stuff up. That there's something that I may not even be able to represent to myself in consciousness. I can't write down all the rules. Like, there's some things I might be like, when if I something I was told, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, Ayaka, but in America, we like slurp soup really loudly in a restaurant. That's like really rude. It's really obnoxious and rude, and people are not gonna be cool with it. But in Japan, isn't it cool to like do that? It's like kind of like a compliment to the chef if you're like sipping your soup and it's like you're like slurping it and stuff like that. Like, I might be able to recognize if I'm right about that. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but um, if there's like a difference in convention like that, like I can make a rule for that. Yeah, 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 for soba and stuff. Yeah. Um, and ramen. If if there is that kind of difference, I might be able to represent that to a rule. Like, I'm like, okay, when I'm in Japan, slurp the noodle soup stuff. When I'm in America, don't slurp. Slurping's bad. Okay, I could maybe do that. But there's so many things about cultural differences that I'm not going to really be able to write down into a principle. But I can still start to like get into it. And at some point, I might wake up one day in that foreign country, and I'm like, I get it. I'm like, I'm in. Not because I'm like choosing to do something, or I've just sort of like naturally picked up on the wavelength. And now when people use those words, I get it on a level that I don't normally get it if I just had a dictionary in front of me. Wittgenstein says at much later in the reading, I don't think it's in the selections I gave to you guys, but he's like, someone can't understand a language game from the outside. They can only understand it if they're playing it. If they're like, if they've uh, what's the word, integrated or assimilated the rules, then they will understand the meanings of the linguistic behavior that's happening within that game. But from outside the game, they won't understand it. There's no frame of reference for understanding linguistic meaning apart from the rules of the games that it's a part of. So if I go to a foreign country with the best grammar text and dictionary ever designed, I will not get it if I don't understand the conventions for behavior, the cultural conventions for behavior. That's what Wittgenstein is saying. So that was a very, very long answer. I hope that helps, though, in just understanding what Wittgenstein is up to generally here. Remember, one of our core questions is not just what determines semantic content or linguistic meaning, but also the question, how do we learn? How is learning possible? So I hope that helped. Okay, here's another one. So what would happen to communication if we figured out how to upload-download thoughts? Can these models support that thought experiment? They both seem to rely on pattern recognition, but say that under these proposals it is encompassing to all communication. Well, that kind of answers it. Well, I'm not sure whether what I said does give a complete answer to this. And this is where I wanted to go next. Let me pull up this quote. I love quoting Wittgenstein. It's good to. I like quoting him when I'm teaching him. Okay, let me read this to you, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, oh, and before I get to this, Wittgenstein refers back a lot to another one of his thought experiment cases, this thing about a slab, like there's two people. Actually, I can draw it here. This is perfect. I love this dinosaur comics thing. This is like the goofiest thing about this whole quarter doing things online with you guys. So here we go. This is perfect. Oh man, I'm gonna have to take a picture. So here's Wittgenstein's slab case. Two dudes hanging out. One person yells slab, and then the other dude is supposed to bring him a slab. Okay, so this was a really what Wittgenstein calls a primitive language. It's a very simple language, not very complicated. What's going on here? Okay, and how is Augustine going to understand this? Well, if the dude brings him a slab, that's because he understands that slab means something like "go bring me a slab," and he's like, "Okay, I will go and bring the thing that you just asked for." Okay, so like this utterance represents something. It's a sign that signifies a certain thought that then T-Rex comes up with the right thought of the slab, and then he's going to bring it. Okay, that's how Augustine would understand it. Wittgenstein's going to think about it in a different way. Okay, here's the quote. Um, Okay, let me start at the beginning. We could imagine that the language of section 2, which is this case right here, was the whole language of persons A and B, even the whole language of a tribe. So like the entire tribe, this is the only language that they've got. It only has those elements. Basically saying slab or brick or arch or whatever, and the person brings that object. The children are brought up to perform these actions, to use these words as they do so, and to react in this way to the words of others. So in other words, when they want a slab, they say slab. And when they hear someone say slab, then they're like, okay, I gotta go bring a slab. Okay, so they've been trained to do this. An important part of the training will consist in the teachers pointing to the objects, directing the child's attention to them, and at the same time uttering a word. For instance, the word slab as he displays the shape. So I draw the picture and I'm like, slab, slab, over and over. Okay? The kids are going to learn it this way. And Wittgenstein says, this is what I was describing as ostensive explanation. And actually, Wittgenstein says, I don't want to call this ostensive explanation or definition because the child cannot, and this is a more technical thing for what Wittgenstein wants to say, I don't want to call it that because the child cannot as yet ask what the name is. So he says, I'm going to call it ostensive teaching of words. But it's not ostensive explanation because Wittgenstein's going to say, and this is a point he brings up a couple times, that asking for an explanation is a particular kind of language game. And if we're imagining this slab language game as the only thing that these people have as a language, then their language does not permit of that activity of asking for definitions of things. So that's why he's going to call it just ostensive teaching of words. Okay, so moving on. I say that it will form an important part of the training. This is what he's kind of Wittgenstein is granting to Augustine, that some part of what Augustine is talking about does apply to language. Because it is so with human beings, not because it could not be imagined otherwise, maybe for aliens or something like that. That for the way that we are psychologically set up, if you point at something with your finger and yell some noises, I will put two and two together in my head. I'll do something with that. Other creatures might do things differently. There might be something else happening. Okay. This ostensive teaching of words can be said to establish an associative connection between word and thing. That's exactly what Augustine wants. But what does this mean? This is Wittgenstein now challenging it. Well, it may mean various things, but one very likely thinks first of all that a picture of the object comes before the child's mind when it hears the word. So it says slab and then the thought comes up. But now, if this does happen, Wittgenstein asks, $1 million question, is it the purpose of the word? Is it the purpose of the word to create the image in the person's head? And Wittgenstein says, this is what he grants to Augustine, it may be the purpose. That might be the purpose. He's not going to rule it out. Maybe that's the game. Maybe the activity is to get a thought to appear in someone's head. I can imagine such a use of words, of sequences of sounds. He says, uttering a word is like striking a note on the keyboard of the imagination. Like my imagination is poised, ready to be manipulated. And when people make certain noises with their mouths, that's like pressing a thing. So if I say like purple donkey smoking doobies, boom, you kind of helped but think of a certain idea, right? Didn't a little image show up in your head when I said that? Boom, that's like the piano of your imagination. Okay, Wittgenstein says it might be the purpose to create the image in the person's head, but then he says, but in the language of two, that is, these people, it's not the purpose of the words to evoke images. He says the purpose of the words is to bring the gosh darn slabs. That's the point. The purpose of yelling slab is not to put an image into the other person's head. It's so that this guy brings this guy a slab. That's the whole point. So this is kind of going back to it that like for Wittgenstein, the this sort of associative connection of meaning that Augustine is playing, Wittgenstein's like, that's cool. I mean, that's a game you can play. That could be part of the activity of language. But he's just saying language has a lot more purposes than just putting ideas into people's heads. There's other things that are going on with language. And we can make room for that Augustinian notion of like associated concepts and stuff like that. And maybe even having the associated concepts spring in my head might be a part of a functional process, but it's not the point. It's not the ultimate thing here. Okay? Question. How can slab cause me to bring a slab without an understanding of a slab? Oh, and then, okay, that's okay. I mean, it's still a good question. This goes back to what the 5 red apples case is supposed to demonstrate. That there's some kind of functional training that I can receive that doesn't require me to have any thoughts of anything. I might be trained that when I hear slab, I just bring slabs. I'm not trained to be like slab, have a thought of a slab, and then go do an activity which matches my thought. And that's one of the really interesting things here. Wittgenstein actually, this is going much deeper into the reading than what you guys were assigned, but it is really, Wittgenstein wants to eventually kind of take language and linguistic meaning out of the head. He's trying to make it happen out here in life. That's where linguistic meaning gets determined, not up here in my head. That's the Augustinian model. But again, like, let me just draw this picture. Remember, Wittgenstein wants to be able to support the Augustinian model. He's saying, yeah, what Augustine's talking about, I can make sense of that. The Augustinian model of sign and signified is just a language game that we can play. Let me pick up that idea and get into it too. I'm responding to your questions and pulling off some of the different points of my lecture from all over the place. But I mean, that's how Wittgenstein does it, so we might as well follow suit. Okay, so let's talk about this idea. At one point, the Augustinian interloper here, when Wittgenstein's like talking to himself in the reading, that at one point the Augustinian interloper says, yeah, but man, one of the reasons for thinking that linguistic meaning is determined by these associated meanings is that give me any word you like. I can give you a definition for it. We can always play this game where word X means Y. Okay? Word X means Y. So I can say, this word has this definition. I can play this game with regard to every linguistic object available to me. I can, you can do the umpire does this. I'm like, what does that mean? Gesture X means you're safe. Right? It's got some message, right? I can cash it out in terms of that message. I'm not following your question, Cameron. I don't know if it's like a joke question or not, but no, not just the realm of action. So you could say, like, what does the word skinny mean? Well, the word skinny means these things, right? Am I getting okay? Yeah, like like asking for a definition. Like I use some philosophy term you haven't heard, and you're like, Tim, what does word X mean? And I'm like, well, word X means blank. And then you're like, okay, cool. Wittgenstein's point about this case is that this doesn't actually support um, the Augustinian model. Like the Augustinian might use this as a reason to think that this is how all linguistic meaning works, because I can always play this game. And Wittgenstein says he questions that. He's like, why would being able to play that game with every linguistic object mean that linguistic meaning should be held captive to that sort of thing? And he uses an example here. I'm going to give you guys another quote. I love this one. He's got so many good little metaphors. Wittgenstein's not the greatest writer, but he's got other things that are cool. Okay. Where is this? Yeah, okay. Suppose someone said, all tools serve to modify something. So a hammer modifies the position of a nail, a saw modifies the shape of a board, and so on. And then Wittgenstein's like, first of all, what's modified by a rule, a glue pot, and nails? And then they're like, okay, well, we can give an answer to that too. A rule modifies our knowledge of a thing's length. A glue pot modifies the temperature of the glue. And nails modify the solidity of a box. Okay, so we were able to play this game with these things. We've been able to explain all tools in terms of how they modify something. But Wittgenstein asks, would anything be gained by this assimilation of expressions? He's like, what's the point of being able to make the claim that all tools serve to modify something? This is like an analogy to what Augustine is doing with language. To be able to say to any word that I can play this kind of game with it, and I can say, hey, look, all the words I've got can fit into this pattern. What is gained by that? How did that help us understand anything at all? Wittgenstein complains about that. That's one argument. The second argument is he says the only reason why we're able to play this game, this word X means Y type of game, is because our language permits us to do that. That we've got rules in our language game that allow us to play that game with words, and other languages may not. That's what Wittgenstein was just saying about the Slav language, that the Slav language doesn't have enough functionality for the people to sensibly ask each other, what does Slav mean? They don't have any room for that in their language. There's no functional role for that sort of thing to happen. So that's another point that Wittgenstein makes here. And there's another idea that connects with this, but I'm going to hold off on that because I got another question. Thanks for all the questions, guys. This is great. I think this is going just the way I wanted it to. So thank you so much for showing up and participating. What about thoughts and words that don't have an action under Wittgenstein's model, such as the thought of the relations of threes and fives? Thought of the relations of threes and fives. Are you saying like, I'm not sure I understand. 3 plus 5 equals 8. Okay. Well, one thing we might say is that mathematics is about concepts. Numbers are concepts. They're abstract entities. I don't see 5 anywhere. I never was like acquainted with the object 5. But it is a concept. And being a concept, I could maybe we could maybe talk about those sorts of relations, the meanings that are present in those relations as meanings of ideas. Remember, Wittgenstein doesn't have a problem with ideas as such. I mean, he says like maybe the purpose of a word is to evoke an image or an idea. Maybe I can figure out some sort of relations there. But also, and this is where there is some tricky questions about this, is something like it is about the action, boss, and the actions are things I'm doing with my thoughts. So how I'm like putting these things together and what I can do with them. And there's rules for this. Like math works by having certain rules and conventions in place. I think maybe Wittgenstein is open to the objection or the question from people who think of logical relationships as being like absolute, that they have some actual reality to them, that they're not just conventional. Maybe Wittgenstein's going to have some problems with that. Wittgenstein in general has problems with relativistic threats. Because when he wants to say that like the meanings of things are determined just by language games, and you can't understand the language game unless you're playing the language game, then on what point is there any kind of objective meaning to anything? That's going to be kind of a problem. And Wittgenstein actually says at one of his most famous claims much later in the reading, where he says, "There's no such thing as a private language. I can't make up a language and use it with myself." because the way that he's thinking about languages is defined by these rules for activities. So there's no way to like have a form of life without other people other than me. And I'm not so sure about that. I mean, maybe there's something I'm missing in Wittgenstein that makes me question that. But that's something that Wittgenstein says that there's a lot of discussion about. Cameron, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Didn't the Zodiac do that? What's the that? Create a private language. No, because they were coordinating things with other people. I mean, it wasn't like one person who was like, and this is where I'm like, I don't know about the private language argument. I'm kind of like, maybe you could come up with a private language. I think Wittgenstein better acknowledge certain things like the activities of what's going on with concepts in my head at some point. But this is a sticking point for him. This is one of the points that where we get very deep into the rabbit hole, and I'm going to pull us out before we get too crazy here. Okay. Oh yeah, that was the idea that I wanted to get to. So let's go back to this whole thing about the word X means Y thing. So here's a pattern that I can put all words into, that they can all fit into this kind of model, this model where we play this game of word X means Y. Wittgenstein, in another place, questions why this would mean anything by using the metaphor of the train. So he's like, you're in the what do you call it, locomotive, the like control center for the train. I don't know, I've never been on a train. I've been on trains, but I haven't been in the whoever's controlling it or the old timey trains. But if you're in this room, I'm going to draw a picture of this room. You see all of these levers in different positions. Okay, so you're in the room. This is the train. There's a window, and the train is up here. Your train. Okay, so you're in this room, and then there's all these levers. I'm just a great artist on it. Here's all these levers, and these levers do different things. They all look the same, and that's why Wittgenstein says words are kind of deceiving because, like, we look at all those letters on the page or the noises that come out of our mouths, and they've got this kind of similarity to them. They look the same. If you just kind of like zone out and look at a page of text, you're like, yeah, it kind of just all look the same. But that doesn't mean that they have the same functions, that they have the same use. And Wittgenstein says the fact that all these levers look the same is pretty much pointless. The fact that I can play this word X means Y sort of game doesn't really matter. It doesn't tell me anything useful or insightful about language. But what does give me insight about language is understanding its function, about how it's used, what purposes it can be put to, and that sort of thing. And the way that we figure that out is by seeing the broader locomotive. What is this lever connected to? And how does it function? So let me pull up a couple quotes here for you. Okay, so he says, it's like looking into the cabin of a locomotive. There are handles there, all looking more or less alike. This stands to reason, since they're all supposed to be handled. The same way that like all the words that I'm going to say it might make sense that they're supposed to be the same because they're all supposed to be made with this stuff. But one of the handles is a crank, which can be moved continuously. It regulates the opening of a valve. Another is the handle of a switch, which has only two operative positions. It's either off or on. A third is the handle of a brake lever. The harder one pulls on it, the harder the braking. A fourth, the handle of a pump. It has an effect only as long as it's moved to and fro. Wittgenstein's always trying to say, even though words look the same, they don't all play by the same game. They all get meaning because of different actions and functions that they're used for. Okay, that's playing things on Wittgenstein's terms of like what's the action, what's the function of things. Conjunction function, or conjunction junction, what's your function? Everything is functional for how Wittgenstein's looking at linguistic meaning. And the only reason why I might say, like, I could put like labels on these things and be like, this lever has this significance, is because of what's happening with the entire rest of the train. If this lever isn't hooked up to the rest of the train in the right way, it's not going to have the effect that I think it will. And that's how Wittgenstein says that, like, even these associative so this is getting transitioning into another idea from Wittgenstein I wanted to share. How are we doing so far? Let me make a little note so I don't forget. Okay, all right. These ideas kind of all, like, they do hang together. They kind of flow to each other, but there isn't so much of a, like, logical proof to all of this. So I'm gonna hold off on going to my next transition and see if you guys have any other questions or stuff. It's going off the deep end. Oh man, most mind blown I've been all quarter. I hope that's a good thing and not a bad thing. I'm not sure what you mean, Rob, by action seems to be context and inference. Um, it I mean, it might be getting back to this, like there's this tricky thing of, like, constantly kind of like slipping back into the Augustinian metaphor, which is predominantly one of, like, images of concepts that I have to think conceptually to understand linguistic meaning. And Wittgenstein's like, linguistic meaning's like the locomotive barreling down the track. That's the meaning right there. It's what's happening, what's going on in reality. Um, it's painful that we're literally doing exactly what he's talking about. You mean like using language? Yeah, yeah. That's So some of Wittgenstein's problems or the things that he brings up with language and the dilemmas and the kinds of questions he's asking that we, like, don't really ask ourselves or hadn't asked ourselves to the same level of depth as Wittgenstein pushed us to in the early 20th century. Some of these things have become major issues for cognitive science. And probably the most work I've told you guys before, cognitive science is one of my, like, philosophical specialities, and I did most of my work on conceptual identity. And man, that is tough. That's where things get really nasty on what you're talking about, Cameron. Of, like, we have to use concepts to make sense of concepts. That's really frustrating. It's really crazy. Yeah, okay, all right. We won't go any further that way. Okay, I might bring that in later, but not right now. Okay. Um, all right. Okay, let me make this transition. So let's go back to the locomotive. So we're in the locomotive, and I tell you, hey, when I pull this lever, the train stops. And you'd be like, wow, that lever is powerful. I just see this little lever, but it makes the whole train stop? Wow, that's crazy. And it really only makes sense, of course, because the lever is hooked up to the rest of the train in just the right way for it to be able to have that significance and meaning. If it wasn't hooked up to, if I just, like, ripped it out and I'm like, hey, check out this lever. This lever's got all this power. It can stop the train. And you're like, not anymore, because you just disconnected it, right? The lever only has the meaning it does because of how it's connected with everything else. And so when Wittgenstein is saying Wittgenstein's going to say, back to the Augustinian model, the only reason why the sign signified connection could even be possibly significant, this little relation here, the only reason it could be significant is because it is against a backdrop of a ton of rules for behavior. Rules for behavior and action. Without this providing the framework, this connection is useless. And to illustrate this point, Wittgenstein brings up his chess metaphor. That's, I think, close to the end of the reading that I assigned for you guys. Let me grab this one. I won't talk about this, and then this might be where we leave tonight. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe we'll talk about some more. Oh yeah, I want to talk about that problem. That one's good too. Oh crap, so much good stuff. Okay. Remember. Oh, I just erased it. Sign. I'm just going to do it like this. Sign and meaning. Okay, so we got the sign and the meaning. Remember again, for Augustine, I make these associative links mostly through ostension. So when I'm like, microphone, 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 that's learning by ostension, okay? I point at things, and then you learn to associate what I'm pointing at with what I'm saying. Okay, so let's say, okay, let me just read this. When one shows someone the king in chess and says, this is the king. So I show you, let's see here. Draw a nice little picture. Oh, this makes me smile so much. I need to write an email to the guy who did quants because he might love this. I think he's a philosopher actually. Um, so if someone shows you the king in chess and says, "This is the king," one does not thereby explain to him the use of this piece unless he already knows the rules of the game except for this last point, the shape of the king. So you could have like maybe you've got some like you know chess. You played chess hundreds and thousands of times, but someone's got like a weird Harry Potter chess set. So you're like, okay. Then they're like, this piece. I don't know. Just picked up this puzzle piece. This piece is the king, and you're like, oh, I didn't know Harry was going to be the king. Well, I should have figured. Of course, he's going to be the king, or something like that. Okay, so it's like now I know what to do with the Harry Potter piece. Now that I know that it's the king, because I already know the rules to chess. If I didn't know the rules to chess and someone was like, this is the king, I'd be like, great, I don't know what to do. Don't know what to do with that piece. Thanks for telling me that information, making that association, but it's useless. Okay? So let me keep going with this. One can imagine his having learned the rules of the game without ever having been shown an actual piece. The shape of the chess piece corresponds here to the sound or shape of a word. However, one can also imagine someone's having learnt the game without ever learning or formulating rules. He might have learned quite simple board games first by watching and have progressed to more and more complicated ones. He too might have been given the explanation, this is the king, if, for instance, he were being shown chess pieces of a shape unfamiliar to him. This is like the Harry Potter thing I was talking about. This explanation again informs him of the use of the piece only because, as we might say, the place for it was already prepared. In other words, we'll say that it informs him of the use only if the place is already prepared. And in that case, it is so, not because the person to whom we give the explanation already knows rules, but because in another sense, he has already mastered a game. Consider this further case. I'm explaining chess to someone, and I begin by pointing to a chess piece and saying, this is the king. It can move in this way, and so on. In this case, we shall say, the words, this is the king, or this is called the king, are an explanation of the word only if the learner already knows what a piece in a game is. So there's all this backdrop here in place that lets this one utterance, this is the king, which is like making this connection between something and a meaning, an associated meaning. That's only useful if I've got all this other stuff already under my belt. Blah, 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 blah. We may say it only makes sense for someone to ask what something is called if he already knows how to make use of the name. So, in other words, this interaction will only make sense between Utah Raptor and T-Rex. This will only make sense if T-Rex knows what to do with whatever answer Utah Raptor is giving him. Only if he knows what to do with the reply is it going to actually be informative. And to be able to know what to do with the reply is a matter of behavior and language game rules and that sort of thing. Vic and Sign closes it with this. We can, after all, imagine the person who is asked, what is this piece? The person replies, decide what to call it yourself. And now the one who asked would himself be answerable for everything. That's like someone asking a question of what something means, and the person saying like some answer that the person doesn't know what to do with that answer. Like you ask me a question in philosophy and I give you an answer and you're like, I don't know what to do with that answer. So that doesn't help me at all. I'm not familiar, I'm not conversant with the rules of philosophy that you are taking for granted, Tim, when you're trying to give me this explanation. Okay? I need to find a way to get you to master that game so that if I give you a certain type of definition, you know what to do with it. You know what significance it's going to have. What function will it perform? The same way that I need to know that this lever has a certain meaning because of how it's connected with the entire rest of the engine. It doesn't have any meaning on its own. And if even the Augustinian stuff is useful and I can learn things by learning how to associate things, that's only because I already understand the rules for the game of what I'm supposed to do with that association. That's the big point that Wittgenstein wants to make here. Okay. Okay, so back to this thing about context. So there's another question here in the chat. Context is not just for Augustine, it's for Wittgenstein too. But Augustine and Wittgenstein are using context in different ways. For Wittgenstein, the context is about rules for behavior. For Augustine, it's a matter of how to interpret the idea of what should be associated with the sign. So when you say some words and I interpret your words using context, I'm still playing an Augustinian model with things. When I'm a Wittgensteinian and I have understanding just because I've mastered rules for a game, that's the key there. That I know what to do with what you have said. I know how to act in response to what you have said. Yeah, go for it, Daniel. Mm-hmm. Here, I'll put it on the feed. Oh, we didn't. Oh. So you drew a picture. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That like if it was just a matter of putting the image in the head, then you could see the one person saying slab and the other guy's just thinking about a slab. And the other guy's like, dude, what's the point here? Like, you're not just supposed to think of the slab. I need you to get me a slab. That's the point. Right? That's the ultimate purpose. That's the function of it. Not to just put the idea in the person's head. There's another discussion that goes on in the reading about, well, maybe slab is an elliptical sentence. In other words, it's shorthand for something like bring me a slab, like the command. That we can cash that out in Augustinian terms. We can be like, yeah, okay, slab just stands for bring me a slab, and bring me a slab. Then he's like having the thought of the command, and then he's like, oh, okay, now I know what to do because I thought of the command. And then Wittgenstein starts making some other trouble for that by saying, well, why do we have to understand it that way? Why do we have to understand slab as short for bring me a slab? Maybe it could be short for all sorts of other things too. And it's not just the arbitrariness of that connection that Wittgenstein is pointing to. He's like, there's other ways to understand the way in which this interaction is taking place. Why does it have to mean that particular thought? There's all sorts of ways that I could think about it. But really, what matters here is bringing the slab, right? The activity. That's how Wittgenstein's trying to pull it back. He's like, it doesn't matter how many different ways I carve it up conceptually. What matters is that this activity happens, that this behavior occurs. That's what's crucial for the communication to be a successful activity or not. And there's some other difficulties there, but I don't want to get into them. We're kind of already pushing the limit on the lecture tonight in terms of length. Gosh, and I kind of want to like catch my breath for a second to think if there's other things I absolutely want to talk about before we sign off tonight. I definitely need to give you guys a code. Um, hmm. Gosh, I didn't think of a good one. I was too busy today to think of a good code. Um, yeah, why not? Yeah, let's do slab. Slab is the code word. That's a good code word. I'll go with that. Slab. Slab's a code word. Okay. All right. Let me think if there's anything else I absolutely want to get into here, and then we can talk. People in the chat. We can talk after I sign off on the video. Um, gosh, there's so many good things here. Okay, I want to leave with this thing. Yeah, let's do this tonight. So, remember, this is picking up on a different tack. Remember that for the Augustinian model of meaning, the way that I learn to be competent with language is by mostly ostension. Ostension lets me associate things together. And Wittgenstein's got some. He thinks some of this stuff is implausible. Like when I say like this is a cup, you know, I could maybe learn the word cup by ostension this way. But how am I supposed to learn the word this or like pointing? Am I supposed to like point at pointing? But if I don't know what pointing is, how does pointing at it help? Like that kind of problem. And there's other words like is. What is is? How could that be ostensibly learned? There's some problems there. But here's the problem that's really concerning about ostensive learning. Um, I'll just do it. I don't need to do this thing. So, um, let's say I'll use these puzzle pieces I've got. So in the camera, let's say I want to teach you the word five. So I say five, five, five. Okay, so this is the situation. In Wittgenstein's example, he's using nuts. Yeah, let me read this one too. This will what I'll sign off on tonight. Now, okay, Wittgenstein says, now one can ostensibly define a person's name, the name of a color, the name of a material, a number word, the name of a point of the compass, and so on. The definition of the number two, that is called two, pointing to two nuts, is perfectly exact. That's what the Augustinian voice says. And then Wittgenstein comes back. But how can the number two be defined like that? The person one gives the definition to doesn't know what it is that one wants to call two. He will suppose that two is the name given to this group of nuts, maybe something like that. Like I'll be like, two is the name for these pieces, these particular individual pieces put together. Maybe apart, not two, together, two. They could think that. He may suppose this, but perhaps he does not. He might make the opposite mistake. When I want to assign a name to this group of nuts, he might take it to be the name of a number. And he might equally well take a person's name, which I explain ostensibly as that of a color, or of a race, or even a point of the compass, like pointing. That is to say, an ostensive definition can be variously interpreted in any case. This is called the frame problem, and the frame problem is one of the most difficult problems for understanding semantic meanings at the most fundamental level. For any set of things that I want a word or a concept even to define, what is it about that set? What property or feature or element is being picked out by just putting that set of things together? There are a million different ways for me to carve up any set of objects as representing something. So I might try to, this comes into like conceptual identities and stuff like that. Let's say I want the concept of blue to kind of be defined by all of the things that are blue. Like I just want to build up a set of them. How do I know that this particular set of things is what's going to refer to this color of blue? How can I do that? That's the same thing that Wittgenstein is bringing up in this case right here. How is ostensive learning supposed to work for me there? And Wittgenstein's answer is very simple. He's like, well, I have to know what kind of game I'm playing. And then I'll know what to do with this move. Two. When you make this move, you can learn things ostensibly like two, or this is the king, or whatever. That can help me learn as long as the ground has been prepared for it. And the ground that needs to be prepared is I have to understand the rules of the language game that we're playing. And that's what's happening. Yeah, it's bleed. Nice joke. Okay, so I'm going to sign off on the lecture tonight for those of you on YouTube. I'll see you guys next week. We could probably do a little more Wittgenstein. I also want to move our schedule along as quickly as possible to the next thing that we have to do. We're going to start doing some morality. And I don't want to short shrift morality too much. It always gets a little smashed here into the end of the quarter. But I'll think about whether there's some more Wittgenstein stuff that just absolutely we have to talk about. We hit up a lot of the big highlights tonight. We kind of did a whirlwind tour. Hopefully this gives you a taste of some of the wackiness that is Wittgenstein and some of the cool questions that we ask about meaning and language. Very fundamental philosophical questions. So hope it's been good for you. Your brain's not too fried. Sometimes it's good to have it stretched around in some weird directions it doesn't usually go in. Stretch those muscles and develop them. But anyway, have a great weekend, everyone. Good luck with your papers. Talk to me about the papers. If you're running into roadblocks, look me up. Call me on my phone. Don't hesitate to bother me. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye.